In tonight's episode, I'll be sharing with you 3 eyewitness accounts that deal with the mysterious, the unexplained, and the supernatural. Lock your windows, lock your doors, and get ready. This is a story submitted to me by a man named David. This is only the second time they've ever written this story down. In fact, it's only ever been told to one other person before this. They're 54 years old and an educated man. They also have a master's degree and spent most of their working career as a public school teacher and principal. So, this encounter took place when they were just 12 years old, being right around 1979 in July or August. They grew up and still live in the metropolitan Detroit area. They're not an only child, but was raised as one, and that's because their 2 sisters are 16 and 18 years older than they are. They were both married and moved out by the time that he was 3. This is important for him to tell us because he is the baby of the family and the youngest of all 19 of his grandmother's grandchildren. He's always been, mostly in fun, been called the spoiled baby of the family. He was grandma's boy, and all 16 of his cousins and 2 sisters knew it. They really enjoyed teasing him about it, which is part of the reason he sat on the story his entire life. He didn't want to give any of them further ammunition to use against him. That, and he didn't think anybody would ever believe him. So, in the summer of 1979, David's father and mother took him on a month-long vacation out west. They had initially planned on going to South Dakota, like the Black Hills and Little Bighorn area, and Yellowstone National Park. His parents owned a motorhome, and that's where they took their trip in. It wasn't huge, maybe a 32-footer. They were in either Montana or Wyoming, but somewhere near Yellowstone. They were 12, so they didn't pay too much attention at the time. They had been traveling for about a week and a half roughly, and had already been to the Black Hills, Little Bighorn, and Mount Rushmore. They were somewhere near Yellowstone, but not in the park. They had stopped in the late afternoon at a campground to go and spend the night. And being the only kid in the family on this trip, they were always looking for other kids to hang out with when they found a stop. So this particular day, David met some other kids, 3 of them to be exact, in the campground, and they were about their age. At first, it was fun hanging out with them, talking with them, and playing around on the playground. After a while, though, they began to get mean with David. During this time, David was just a little bit overweight, so these kids began calling him names and teasing him. And soon he left the playground and stayed away from them the rest of the day. A few times throughout the later afternoon and evening, they had rode past their campsite on their bikes, making some more rude remarks about David and laughing, continuing to joke and mock his weight. David, who fortunately was pretty thick-skinned, excuse the pun, did not let much get to him. And after dinner and a campfire after dark, they all retired to the motorhome for the night. His parents slept in the back of the RV, where the main dining room and table folded down into a bed. This is where David would sleep, in front of the RV, where the couch would fold down into a bed. The couch/bed was against the wall on the driver's side of the RV, with the window right above it. He lay there in the dark, going over the day's events in his head, and began to drift off to sleep. He was jolted out of place between asleep and awake by a tapping sound outside the RV on the wall directly outside from the bed. David had heard similar sounds before when rain or condensation from the rooftop AC unit would drip down outside the camper. David just simply thought this was water from the AC, ignoring it, and tried to go back to sleep. The tapping of the water, though, hitting the fiberglass camper persisted and tried to doze off. Then, all of a sudden, there was a loud bang, like somebody had hit the side of the RV with their fist. And then it went back to the tapping as if dripping water again. David tried his best to ignore it and passed it off as nothing, trying to go back to sleep. The tapping persisted, and after a few more minutes of it, the loud bang on the side of the RV came again. And this time, he knew it wasn't water. Immediately, his mind went to the 3 mean boys he met earlier in the day, and figured it was them trying to mess with him or scare him. The tapping started again, and a minute later, the bang a second time. Now, 12 years old, David was angry, and these boys were hitting his family's RV. The tapping started yet again, and now he planned on waiting for the bang, then yanking the blind up on the window to try and catch them in the act. So he sits up, his hand is on the drawstring of the blind, listening to the tapping, which he found had started yet again. And he's anxiously waiting for the bang so he could yank the drawstring and catch them. But after a minute or so of tapping, came the bang again. He yanks the cord, the shade flies up, and he presses his face up to the glass to look down on the boys. To his horror, he didn't see any boys, but what he saw still haunts him to this day. When he yanks that drawstring and looks out the window, there, staring back at him, was this huge hairy face only inches away from David's, looking back at him. The window was only about 5 or 6 feet off the ground to the bottom of the window, and roughly 7 or 8 feet to the top of the window. This giant hairy face wasn't looking directly at David, but the creature the face belonged to was actually hunched over to look into the window. The owner of the face had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall to have to bend down to look down into the window, and David was instantly terrified beyond all belief. There was no sound, and after a few seconds, he just lets go of the drawstring. The shade falls back into the closed position, and he sat there in the bed completely motionless, just frozen with fear. He doesn't know how long he sat there before he eventually laid back down in the bed. He had never heard the tapping sound or the banging again, and never lifted the shade again after that. Eventually, he did fall asleep and awoke the next morning in the daylight to the RV traveling down the road as he did almost every morning that trip. He never told his parents about the previous night, and never told anybody until now. He still has no explanation of what it is he saw. He just knows that it scared him very badly, and he's never been scared like that before. At this time, he had never even heard of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, because remember, Bigfoot at this time had not really circulated through pop culture, at least not yet. And not too many years later, he would see an episode of In Search Of. It was about Bigfoot, and at that moment, right then and there, he knew what he had seen outside the RV window that very night. This next story was submitted to me by a man whom we'll call Richard. This happened to him when he was about 5 or 6 years old, but it was so intense that he'll never ever forget it. His mom had taken his 2 sisters and Richard to Fiji, where they would stay with the father's family. In the same home, with tin walls and a tin roof, lived 2 of Richard's uncles, 1 aunt, and 4 of his cousins, all male in their 20s. His father was to come and join us a bit later in that week. Now, during this week, without Richard's father, his mother and him stayed in the same room that had a window facing the front yard, where there were a few bushes. But there was one bush in particular that he was always warned not to look into at night, as many of his family members claimed to see a pair of yellow eyes looking into the room. Of course, being a little kid, curiosity always got the best of Richard, and he would be tempted to look, but he can't say that he saw what they were talking about, so he'd always just simply dismiss these claims as fairy tales or trying to spook him. Now, a week goes by, and his father had finally arrived on the day of Christmas Eve. This was great for him because it was just in time for some presents, but that night, something would happen that would leave Richard questioning the true nature of the world that he lives in today. His mom would always make Richard go to bed early, and they shared the same bed. There is a net attached to the tall bedpost that goes over all sides of the bed to protect you from mosquitoes. At some point, late in the night, he was awoken by a loud banging and a lot of commotion. He could hear panic in the loud voices from the living room where his father, his brothers, and cousins were all chatting away before they went to bed. Being a little brat who usually got away with whatever Richard wanted, he would creep out of bed, leaving his mom to go and see all the excitement in the house. He opens the door to his room, and excited to see one of his cousins scared, panicking and looking for a knife in the kitchen, he simply walks into the living room where his family was freaking out. both uncles yelling orders from the couch, and his cousins afraid, standing by the front door, and the other two in the kitchen, frantically looking for weapons. The only calm person in the room was Richard's father, sitting there on the couch by himself. Confused, he asks his cousin closest to him, "What's going on?" And his cousin just says, "Shh, just listen." And he noticed. He was looking at the front door, and he could hear it. What sounded like somebody wearing gumboots stomping on the front porch that was made of wood. He's confused about why they were so scared and questioned why nobody just opened the door, but they all just ignored him. After what felt like 5 to 10 minutes of this constant heavy stomping, Richard's oldest cousin, Vicky, cautiously approaches the door, swings it open really fast, trying to catch whoever was out there. But in that exact instant, the stomping ceases, and there's nobody there. He shuts the door just like a light switch, and the stomping started up again. They all step back and begin to notice a second noise. Someone was also banging on the back door. A loud pounding that was so aggressive, the door shook a little with each thud. And his cousin Vicky then went to go open the back door, with Richard following at a distance behind. But when the door opened, the same thing had happened. The noises stopped all at once, and there was nobody to be seen. So he yells out a few curse words and closed the door, jumping back when the noise started again almost instantly. The front porch, the back door, and now the side door to the house all had someone pounding on it, or so it seemed. Richard, who was this cocky little kid, went and grabbed the biggest knife in the kitchen, being a meat cleaver. One of his family grabs the cleaver from him, handing him a rolling pin instead. And they're all looking for and grabbing these weapons. A devastating crash comes from the roof, followed by what sounded like pebbles raining down on the tin roof as well. And then another crash, followed by raining pebbles, and another, and another. Richard wasn't feeling so brave all of a sudden because, in his mind, he had thought all these events and noises at the doors were just some carefully orchestrated prank by some really fast people. But this was different. These crashes were very intense, and whoever was making it had to be incredibly strong because these sounded like large stones, and to smash them so hard, they would bounce up, turn to pebbles, and would take large amounts of strength. So they all stood in a line, ready to open the side door, but everybody was practically pooping bricks at this point, nobody actually able to make a move. Then, his father walks into the room, standing right in front of the side door where they were all waiting to be attacked. So Richard's father looks at Richard in the eyes and says, "Stay inside." He gathered himself, remaining calm, opening the door and stepping out. Richard immediately ran to the open door, concerned about his father's safety, thinking that he was going to go back up to help him, but he watched him walk about 15 to 20 feet out into the yard, turn, and face the house. Richard doesn't know if he saw anything, but he watched him lift his head to face the roof of the house. Then, with outstretched arms, about the height of his hips and palms facing up, he said very loudly and clearly, "Now, you've seen me. You can go." He kept his gaze at the roof for about another whole minute, then calmly walked back inside. There was no longer any noise, all the weird events just stopped, and all of Richard's family, stood there a little shocked, trying to calm down before going back to bed. Fast forward to the next morning, and Richard asks his father, "What was that, and how did you make it just go away?" And he looks at Richard in his eyes and could see that he was somewhat hesitant, contemplating if he should tell Richard or not, but then relaxed and told Richard a little story. He informed Richard that when he was growing up, he had an older sister. He didn't know his father, and it was just her, his mom, and his 3 older brothers. Life was difficult for them because they barely had any money at all, and him being the smallest, he was always picked on and tormented by his brothers. But his sister, she loved him, always watched out for him, and did her best to make sure he was fed and clothed. Well, one day, when he wasn't home, his sister was ironing some of his clothing that he wore to school as his uniform. There was a glass of water on the ironing board that she would use to fill the iron for steam. As she was ironing, The glass had fell onto the electrical outlet and the iron cord, which resulted in her getting violently electrocuted, leading to her death. And he said, "So whenever I come home, my sister comes to see me and to make sure that I'm okay." Richard was shocked by hearing this and didn't know whether to be afraid or to feel at ease. It was very confusing for him as a child to truly understand what Richard had just heard by his father. He remembers saying nothing and could see that his dad had regretted even speaking. Richard's father then tells him not to worry and that nothing can hurt him. Richard, who's so confused, trying to decipher whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, whether this was a loving entity or an angry one, as the events of the previous night were so increasingly violent. But, needless to say, the rest of the trip in Fiji was uneventful, and continues to enjoy himself with his family, friends, playing soccer in the warm rain in the jungle, eating ice cream, and lighting fireworks, which he smuggled back to Canada in his mom's suitcase somehow. Though it was now behind him, and in the back of his mind, he can never forget what happened that very night. The memory will stay with him forever, so vividly, and probably will remain until the day he dies. This is Colton's story that reveals just how awful Colorado can be. He's 37 now and has lived in Grand Junction, Colorado since 1984. Having lived here since he was 10 years old, you could imagine that he's explored just about every nook and cranny to be found in the immediate area. Roughly in 2002, his best friend and him decided to take his Jeep up to the world's largest flat-top mountain called the Grand Mesa, which is just east of town that he lived in. At the time, he was driving his vehicle as he had not yet got his driver's license. This place is an unimaginably large expanse of wilderness, sparsely populated with homes, log cabins, and one ski resort. On the day that they had decided to go up there camping, they were sick of society and had wanted to go and get away as far as possible. They ended up driving there to a little town called Colburn, and as they had camped there a few times before, they were confident they can find a spot that catered to their needs. After driving through the one-street town, they made their way to the outskirts and literally found a road that looked like it would take them out to the middle of nowhere. Just what they wanted. So they turned off and followed this dirt road for nearly an entire hour until they get to the literal end. They are already in high spirits, ready to get out and roast some marshmallows, cook some hot dogs, maybe do a bit of hiking. You get the idea. Well, at the very end of this long road was a pre-existing campsite, complete with a pre-built fire pit and some sitting logs. Life is good. So, Colton and friend began to unload and set up camp. And after setting up camp, they decide to go take a walk around and maybe check out their surroundings a little bit better. Everything appears to be as it should be. Large stands of aspens peppered with the occasional evergreen tree. They admitted to me that at the beginning of the hike, they felt a bit uneasy but could not put a finger on it, and certainly did not explain this to his friend, as they're both 18 at the time and, well, you know how 18-year-old boys can be, they like to pretend they're tough. So anyway, Colton and friend continue up on this small trail, talking and just viewing the gorgeous scenery around them. After about 15 or so minutes of walking, they come around a bend on the trail, and sitting there in the middle of the trail, an hour away from anywhere, was an SUV. There isn't anything particularly odd with this, they suppose, but it did make them pause. After checking it out thoroughly, without opening up the doors, they began to notice one strange thing about it. It had been a fairly new vehicle and had been up in the elements for so long that it literally had mud and dirt caked on the windows and paint. The windows were so caked you could not see into it. It just looked like it had been sitting there for a long time. And as they wrote this to me, they realized that this might not seem like such a big deal at the time, but it seemed so out of place it really creeped them out. Just the fact that it was such a nice new vehicle, and then it had very possibly been there for quite some time. They don't know. It gave them both a pause, and they decided that maybe it was a good idea to get back to camp and just leave it alone. After all, it wasn't theirs. So, by the time maybe an hour or so left of daylight, they quickly had walked back to camp and started dinner. They began a fire, made dinner, all the while talking philosophy, as they often did. And after about 2.5 hours, Colton and friend began getting a bit sleepy. so now was the perfect time to turn in. They were sharing a tent, so they both got in, and about 45 minutes after laying down, they both apparently fell asleep right around the same time. Now, this is where the story starts to get really odd. Colton has always been a very vivid dreamer, and more often than not, he will recall his dreams upon waking. Well, anyway, shortly after falling asleep, he began dreaming intensely, which for him is a bit odd to dream so soon after falling asleep. He dreamt that they were sitting at the fire at the same camping spot, and in this dream, a dark, evil presence materialized up around them and demanded that his friend and him leave the place immediately, that this place was not for them, and that if we didn't leave, bad things would befall them. It wasn't like a being materialized, but rather a dark, heavy mist. He remembers waking up, screaming, and at the very same time, his friend is waking up too, obviously shaken. Colton immediately tells him about his dream, and the color on his friend's face drains. He goes on to recount his dream, and it was basically the same dream both boys had had, down to a T. His friend is a very pragmatic person and not given to running with his imagination. It is safe to say that at this point, Colton and friend are very shaken up by this experience. They can't explain it, so they glance at a watch and notice they hadn't even slept for an hour at this point, and by this time, it was a bit before midnight. It was extremely dark, and they're both scared out of their minds now. So they quickly unstake their tent, roll it up into a ball with all their stuff still inside of it, throw it to the back of his Jeep, and the realization that they're so far out in the wilderness, down a bumpy dirt road, about an hour away from even the slightest hint of society, is really beginning to play on their nerves, filling them both with anxiety. But after making sure they had everything, they jump in the Jeep, started heading back down the road as fast as the road would allow. At some point or another, Colton notices lights in the distance behind them, specifically 2 lights following them. Lights that seemed at first to be headlights. This further instilled fear into both of them and caused the engine to push a little harder. Now what happens next will always stick with Colton and friend because it completely baffles both of them. So these lights come up from quite a distance behind and super fast. And he means 1 second, they're maybe half a mile behind, and in the next blink of an eye, they are right behind him, sitting here comfortably in the bed, writing this now 19 years later. He cannot detail you how beyond frightened they both were. These lights would be right up on their bumper, and then they would zoom back a bit. A few times, they would lift up in the air and converge into one singular light, and then zoom back down, as splitting back into 2. This went on for at least 20 to 30 minutes. No noise was heard though, no engine, no tires, nothing, other than their panicked screams, yells, and cries. And he felt that it is important to note that these lights were just that, lights. They weren't attached to any object or visible vehicle, not even the silhouette. Even when they were right on their bumpers, there was no indication that these lights were attached to something. Suffice to say, they had left that road that night with their lives, and eventually made their way off the mountain back into the town. And they remember stopping at a village inn so they could be around some people and see some sort of normalcy again. They've been back up to this camping spot a few times since then over the years, but never that same place, obviously, for fear of what would happen. Never again did they have this sort of scary experience, and honestly, he's okay with that, and since then has deeply learned to trust his gut feelings, especially while in the wilderness. The world is indeed a much stranger place than what we are all led to believe. This is a lesson Colton only needed to learn once. Colton never did tell anybody else about this, never even reported that strange vehicle or the events that followed. I mean, how do you call the cops and tell them such a tale? Over the years, they've tried to bring it up to their friend, but that single event was just too much for him. And Colton thinks that his friend was so scared that it shook his entire worldview so much that he's in complete denial, or was able to put the traumatic experience out of his mind entirely. Either way, this is a true account. Neither of them were on drugs or alcohol, and both completely sober. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, be sure to go ahead and slap that like button, leave a comment below, let me know what you'd like to see for future content, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and make sure your notifications are on, and so that way you'll never miss another great piece of content coming from yours truly. And keep a lookout because I have a plethora of stuff coming, from conspiracies to cryptids to human experimentation and more.